speaking on a topic that I think is scientifically really very complex, but personally really simple. On a personal level, pain is pain. And I think there's this interaction between us when we become a patient and clinicians. And that interaction is sometimes fraught with difficulty, and especially if you have an inflammatory condition and the pain is what we term chronic. But all to be covered in the next half an hour or so. And so I'm going to share my screen and bring up the slides. My name is Dr. Rabia, and I am a gastroenterologist and also a researcher into conditions of the gut-brain connection. And I have also recently qualified as a cognitive behavioral hypnotherapist. And so as you see, the kind of tapestry of this talk is leading up to explaining how that could really influence the management of pain. So at the outset of the talk, I have a few questions for you. What exactly is pain? What could be the purpose of defining pain? Is it obvious, or in fact, is pain itself a mystery? Now, what we know is that pain is a fundamental experience of all living things, and yet pain to one person might not actually be pain to another. It's a subjective experience, it's a private experience. And on the flip side as well, pain to one person could even be pleasure to someone else. Think about people who get tattoos. Or would you be more inclined to think that there's a threshold at which point pain becomes pleasure or pleasure becomes pain? Now, of course, here I'm not talking about the kind of pain you suffer from if you have a long-term inflammatory condition. But at the start of our session this evening, it would be really helpful to have a look at how people, from scientists to philosophers, have attempted to define this uniquely individual experience over the years, and how we might attempt to use such definitions in an exploration of pain in our own bodies in the here and now. In 1979, the International Association for the Study of Pain approved the following definition. Pain is an unpleasant, sensory or emotional experience associated with actual or potential tissue damage, or described in terms of such damage. Now, when I first came across this definition, I thought, ooh, that sounds really good. I like the fact that it says actual or potential, as I will come on to describe as the talk progresses. But it's really interesting how scientific colleagues over the years, particularly since the 1980s, criticized this definition. You can probably already spot some stuff that you're not too happy with, being a person who is either suffering from pain or knows someone who does. For example, unpleasant, really? Is that not the understatement of the century? And then there's the idea of associated with. And very often than not, people interpret association as causation. And the fact is, pain isn't always caused by actual or potential tissue damage. We'll go on to that in a moment. And then there's the idea of description. Well, what about infants? What about non-human animals? What about people with learning difficulties? And lastly, probably closest to my specialty area, is this idea of differentiating emotional experiences from sensory ones. Are they really different? Does the mind-body divide really exist? So Cohen and colleagues, these scientists who criticized the definition, came up with a new one. 2018. Pain is a mutually recognizable somatic experience that reflects a person's apprehension of threat to their bodily or existential integrity. Now, the two key areas of this definition I would love to draw your attention to is the idea of somatic. Somatic refers to the sensory nervous system. So this network of the thousands and millions of nerve cells throughout the whole body, emanating from the brain to the spinal cord and out into your fingers and toes. the process of sensory stimuli as interpreted by the brain. The second area, apart from somatic, is this idea of threat. Now, as I mentioned, my particular area is the gut-brain connection, very relevant for those in the audience who suffer from inflammatory bowel disease, but also for those who suffer from inflammatory arthritis, because every single organ in the body, whether it's your skin, whether it's your joints, whether it's your tissues, muscles, and tendons, communicate with the brain via the nervous system, and this idea of threat. So pain exists in the body to help us avoid dying. It's a survival instinct. It's so primal. It goes back to when we were cavemen being attacked by tigers in the bushes. But what does this idea of threat, particularly in modern life where threats are so wildly different, do to our nervous system? Now, before we dive into that area, I wanted to go over a few more distinctions, which I feel are really very important in the idea of pain. Now, the first one is there is a difference between acute pain, which is essentially pain that has occurred, and this is how doctors define it. Pain occurs under 6 weeks in duration. So acute meaning on the one hand new, but also any change in your pain. So I want to encourage you at the outset of this talk, which is predominantly about the psychological management of pain, that if you experience new pain, so under 6 weeks duration, or a change in your existing pain, the first step is always to seek appropriate medical attention from a licensed healthcare professional. However, much more pertinent to the audience is this idea of chronic pain. Chronic pain is anything over 6 weeks duration, and also something that potentially you've had diagnosed by a doctor or a physiotherapist, but that can't be cured necessarily or gotten rid of entirely, unless you're taking lots of medication and maybe you've got it under control. Now, there was a chap called Wolf, who was also a researcher and a doctor, and he wrote a paper called "What is this thing called pain?" He then established that there were 3 types of pain, and I'd love to introduce you to this simple definition. The first type of pain is something that we all experience so rapidly, and it's called, number 1, nociceptive pain. This is the kind of pain which it activates your withdrawal reflex. So imagine that you've placed your hand on a hot hob or near to fire, and the example I've got in the photograph there is when you're lighting a candle. What happens when you experience pain is so rapid, so fast, it's called the withdrawal reflex. And it doesn't even reach your brain. You can't control it. There's a really, really rapid electrical signal that goes from where you touch the fire all the way to the spinal cord and back. That means that you withdraw your hand from the fire. Now, what's interesting about this type of pain is that it has a high threshold. What do I mean by threshold? Well, essentially, it's a high tolerance. So really, we want to be able to light a candle and get really close to a flame, but the moment it's going to cause us threat, we want to be able to withdraw. So high threshold and also high stimulus. So it's this idea that, okay, something needs to be very, 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 very hot or sharp or cold before the withdrawal reflex is activated. Type 1 pain, nociceptive pain. Type 2, the one you've all been waiting for, inflammatory pain. This is arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease. We've got a picture of someone holding their foot, maybe some inflammation in one of the tarsal joints of the foot. Now, this, interestingly, is low threshold pain. Again, it's an adaptive response to help us survive. You want to know when you have that diagnosis, you first have the experience of Crohn's or colitis or rheumatoid arthritis. You want to have a really low threshold for the body going, hey, I'm in pain. You need to seek medical attention. But similarly, the stimulus is quite high. We can tolerate some inflammation in the body, but once it gets to a certain stimulus, we want to get that diagnosis. And the third type of pain is something called neuropathic pain. Neuro, meaning nervous system, and something like a tension headache, fibromyalgia, or irritable bowel might represent this category of pain. And for this, it's low threshold. We pick up these kind of conditions far more easily than we do the others. Low threshold, low tolerance, and low stimulus. Sometimes stress at work can stimulate tension headaches. Question is, what do we do about it? Now, to simplify this absolutely even further, I like to use the analogy of a car alarm. So, type 1 pain. You're lighting a candle, it gets too hot, and you withdraw your hand. Type 1 pain is like a burglar going into your car, the alarm goes off, and the police get called. Perfect. That's the exact kind of response we want the body to have. Second, the burglar gets into the car, the alarm goes off, you seek attention, great, the problem is solved. However, inflammatory problems in the body hypersensitize, they make the nerves of the body really sensitive so that the next time you have a problem, the threshold gets lower and lower. So the next time someone comes to the car to go in, the burglar alarm goes off more frequently. A really good example of this is like having a surgery. So imagine you've had inflammatory bowel disease, you've had a little bit of your bowel removed because of Crohn's, you have a surgical scar. Sometimes that scar can be painful, a lot long after the surgery's gone. What's that about? The third type, which is the neuropathic pain, is like when a cat or when someone brushes past the car and the alarm goes off. We've all had that experience in the middle of the night. And that's the kind of pain that inflammatory pain could potentially become. Sometimes the car alarm's going off, the pain signal's going off, but there's no real threat to our survival. So I'd like you to encourage for the rest of the talk to think of pain super simply. It's a sensory signal that is shiftable. And what do I mean by shiftable? Well, it comes back to this idea of threshold. Threshold is a magnitude or an intensity that must be exceeded for a certain reaction to be manifested. And the question is, can you shift that threshold? Are you empowered to shift it? And if so, how? After all, that is what many drugs do. They shift the threshold. So we come on to the idea of how. What's going on really? What are the other influences? Because remember, you can't really influence the stimulus. Sometimes the stimulus is there, sometimes it's not. And you can't influence that, but there is so much that you can influence. And I've called this the ABCD approach. Number 1, affect. Psychologists call emotion affect. You'll be interested to know in much of the research. So A is for affect. Our pain is affected by affect. It's affected by our emotions. How does it make you feel to see that little girl with paint all over her face? Number 2, bidirectional. The role of emotion in pain is bidirectional. What do I mean? Pain causes us to feel negative. That needs no explanation. Of course it does. You get irritable, you get annoyed, you get teary. But if we feel negative, pain gets worse. More on that in a moment. Number 3, C is for conditional. Pain is actually a learned behavior via association. Now, if this was an interactive talk, and I very much wish it was, I would be asking you if you know anything about Pavlov's dogs. Maybe I could see some nodding heads or not. Pavlov was a Russian psychologist, Ivan Pavlov, from the 1890s, and he discovered something fascinating called classical conditioning. Really simply, he found that dogs salivate when they eat food, as do humans. However, he also noticed that when he was walking down the stairs to visit his dog, the dog could hear the footsteps and started salivating before the food arrived. Then he conducted a very key experiment in psychology, one that has been replicated in humans with gut problems, you'll be pleased to know. What he did was he paired a completely neutral response called the bell. So he rang a bell. At the same time, he measured the dog's salivary response as he placed a fresh piece of steak in front of the dog. Steak, dog salivary response, and bell, all paired together. And then lo and behold, when he rung the bell and didn't provide any steak, the dogs salivate. So he paired the bell with the salivation response of the dog in the absence of the stimulus, which was the meat. Keep that analogy in your mind, and I'll come back to it in 2 minutes. The last one, ladies and gentlemen, this is the most important, the idea of distraction. Pain requires your attention. It requires your attention. If you are not giving your attention to your pain changes. Now, you may say to me, well, I don't really want to distract myself from something. I don't want to distract myself from the pain. It's a useful signal. Well, as I explained earlier, it's a useful signal in some circumstances, particularly if you're having a flare-up of your colitis and you need to seek medical attention. Remember what I said about the idea of acute pain. If it's new or if it's changing, you know your body best. You seek medical attention. But unfortunately, sometimes we're living with pain where our attention needs to be modified. And I quote to you from Eckhart Tolle, who is the author of a book called The Power of Now. Eckhart Tolle says, attention is the key to transformation, and full attention also implies acceptance. Attention is like a beam of light, the focused power of your consciousness that transmutes everything into itself. But let's not take Eckhart Tolle at his word, or indeed even me. Let's move on to the scientific experiments that have been conducted by, I'm proud to say, my supervisor, Professor Qasim Aziz, and also Cohen and colleagues in the years 2005, 8, and 9. The first study that Cohen conducted in 2009 looked at the role of emotion in pain. They basically did something very, very simple. They played really emotionally sad music and then neutral music. And then they delivered pain and then they delivered no pain. So 4 scenarios. So really emotionally sad music with pain and without pain, neutral music with and without pain. What did they find? Well, obviously, sadness ratings increased following negative mood. So when they played the sad music, people felt sad. However, how interesting. There was no significant impact on the subjective perception of pain. So you've all probably been asked by doctors, rate your pain from 0 to 10, 0 being no pain, 10 being the worst pain you've ever felt. And that's how we do it in studies as well. No significant impact on the subjective pain. So people felt, oh, I'm listening to sad music, but the pain feels the same. However, when they did MRI images of the brain, there was increased activity in the right side of the brain. And this shows the brain is processing pain differently under negative emotion. Hold that thought. The next study. This is the one where you have to bring back that memory of Pavlov's dogs. They did it in humans, and they used the esophagus, so the food pipe running down the center of the neck. For the gut health patients, very, very relevant because it replicates what we call visceral pain. They blew up a balloon in the esophagus to stretch it and cause a simulation of pain. And what did they do? They showed participants 3 colors, 3 circles to be exact: yellow, blue, and green. The yellow circle was paired with pain by blowing up a balloon in the food pipe. The blue circle was paired with a puff of air on the wrist. And the green circle was paired with nothing. Like Pavlov's dogs, the pairing was really easy. They did MRI images of the brain and looked at oxygen levels in different aspects of the brain, and they found that it was very easy to flash up a yellow circle and associate that with the pain, the blue circle with the puff on the wrist, and the green with no pain. And then what they did is, after the learning phase of pairing it together, they had an anticipation phase where they only flashed up the circles, but only sometimes did they deliver the stimulus. And then they had an extinction phase where they paired nothing at all. What did they find? That the anticipation of pain lighted up the same parts of the brain as when actual pain was administered. So the causing of pain is associated and learned with lots of different behaviors. And to take that into a really human experience, our feelings of what causes pain and what doesn't cause pain were essentially written long ago. Imagine in childhood where you fell down, hurt your knee, or your belly was sore and mum maybe rubbed it. That's when the associations and the conditioning really happened. And essentially, we all know that during those early childhood years, 0 to 5, so much of our memory is stored. And the last study I just want to show you very briefly is again by the same group about distraction. They distracted people in the group from pain, and they found that pain, when it was delivered during distraction, there was a significant reduction in pain ratings. And this was reflected in a significant decrease in brain activity in the areas of the brain, the right anterior cingulate cortex, where pain is processed. So these are the studies that have demonstrated this ABCD approach, that emotion affects it, there's a bidirectional approach, that pain is really a learned behavior, and that distraction is not only possible on an emotional level, but in the brain as well. And so we come to the idea that there is a difference between our sensations and our suffering. So, hypnotherapy. Don't we all have an idea of what this could be? I mean, essentially, there are many popular misconceptions of hypnosis. And I think that that is because of stage performance, Darren Brown and all of the people who essentially make you think that there's a pendulum involved or a clock, and that you wave it in front of the face and essentially you bark like a dog and there's nothing you can do about it. But let's talk about not hypnosis necessarily, but hypnotherapy and the role that hypnotherapy can play for you in managing pain. And so the word hypnosis or hypnos comes from the Greek word meaning sleep. And it's actually an abbreviation of neurohypnotism, which means sleep of the nervous system. So remember, pain is an experience of the nervous system. And so sleep of the nervous system is essentially this idea that if we dampen down the nervous system response, and when we have control over that, we can heavily influence the way that we have this private and subjective experience of pain. Now, hypnotherapy has also been called imagination therapy, and this speaks to the power of our imagination. What do you do when you come to therapy? Well, it's essentially inducing a state of mind where you are susceptible to positive suggestions. And you do that by the extensive use of your imagination, which as adults we have completely lost, or have we? Now, to speak briefly about a sister therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy, although outside the scope of this talk, it's worth talking about just briefly this cycle. The cycle is this, that our thoughts influence our feelings influence our behavior, and our behavior influences our thoughts. Now, I'm going to stop the screen share and I'm going to move on to gallery view. Now, for the last few minutes, I've talked on for a long time, and I thank you for your attention throughout the whole talk. It's actually a gift, so thank you for that. We're going to do a little experiment. So for just a few minutes, I encourage as many people as possible out of the 53 with us in the virtual room to turn on your cameras, if you don't mind. So as many as possible, but if you don't want to, that's okay. Lovely to see you guys. Now, oh, how wonderful. What a greatly engaged group. Thank you so much. It's such a nice thing to see people. Hello, hello. Now, let's do a little thought experiment, and then I've got one conclusion slide, and then I'll swiftly hand over for the Q&A. Here we go. So, finding a comfortable, relaxed position. So, getting yourself nice and comfortable. You're going to drop your shoulders away from your ears and relax your arms. And when you're ready, close down your eyes. You need only my voice. Closing down your eyes, and notice as you do so how your internal environment has become more real than your external environment. Now, we're going to go on a little imagination experiment. And before we do, I'd encourage you all to take a few deep breaths. So with your eyes closed, take a deep inhale through the nose, exhale out through the nose or mouth. Lovely. Relaxing the body from the crown of the head to the tips of the toes. Let the breath settle, let it just be. Now, I'd like you all to imagine that you're walking into your kitchen. Walk into your kitchen and walk over to your countertop space. That's it. Walk over to the countertop. And as you look down onto your countertop space, you see a rectangular wooden chopping board. On that chopping board is a bright yellow lemon. And next to it is a sharp knife. Pick up the knife and slice through the lemon. As you do so, as you break through the zest and the rind of the lemon, you sense an infusion of strong, citrusy, lemony scent waft up to the nose. And then you slice again, and you see the juice of the lemon dripping down and spilling onto the chopping board, that citrusy, zesty, juicy lemon dripping onto the chopping board, and you continue to slice the lemon. The seeds fall out and the juice drips over. Lovely. Now wipe the image from your mind like a painter taking a brush. Let that image fade away. Next, without opening your eyes, I would like you to extend your right palm towards me. So hold your right palm out towards me, palm facing the ceiling. That's it. Relax the shoulder. Lovely. Next, I would like you to imagine that I'm in the room with you and I walk over to your arm. Allow the arm to be levitating in the air, so not resting on anything at all. Lovely. I'm walking over to your arm and I pick up an incredibly large and heavy book. The book is so heavy it weighs 2 to 3 kilograms, and I place it on the palm of your hand, and it's the size of an encyclopedia. The heavy book rests upon your arm, and it lies there as you hold the heavy book into your arm. Your arm is contracting to hold the heavy book nice and still. The arm feels the weight of the book heavy on the palm of the hand. And next I place another equally large, equally heavy book, 2 to 3 kilos on top of the second book. I place that book on top, and your arm feels the weight of the heavy 2 to 3 kilos size of the second book placed onto the palm of the hand. And now I take one book off the palm of the hand and I take it back into my hands, and suddenly the arm feels lighter and more free. And you feel the difference between the weight of the two books. And then I take that last book off of the palm of the hand, and now you are relieved of all heavy books, and the arm suddenly feels free and light again. When you're ready, relaxing the arm down into the lap, taking a deep breath in through the nose, exhaling through the nose or mouth, blinking the eyes open and returning to the room. Handing over to Ampersand for a quick poll.
Thank you, Ravia. So Sarah, I think you've got a poll to share with the room. Feels funny coming out of it with your eyes haven't been shut. So yeah, you should see a poll now on your screen that asks you, what did you experience? Did you see yellow, taste lemon, or feel heavy?
So you can answer basically to all of them, because they were two different thought experiments. One was the kitchen and the other was the sensation of the book. So feel free, take your time. We're going to wait till many of you have responded. I'd love to see how you respond. And just to talk while the responses are coming in, this was an experiment. This is a common hypnotherapy thought experiment conducted also by Mark Jensen to the Royal College of Physicians at the Royal Society of Medicine conference very recently. So almost getting up to 50 votes. Let's see a few more. Lovely. And it's one of the kind of thought experiments that we use. All 3 for me from somebody in the chat. Lovely. So as long as you're clicking through, nice and easy. Lovely. Good. So we've had about 82% voted. So I suppose a few more seconds. Someone's asking to please repeat the question. Has the poll ended or are we still in the poll? The vote would only accept one. The vote would only accept one option. Is that true? Is everyone nodding? Interesting. Interesting. Okay, so what we will do then, I guess what we'll see is that's probably our error. So apologies for that. So what we will do is when we unmute potentially at the end, I'd love to see we'll take these numbers with a slight pinch of salt, and people can write in the chat as well. But not the remove. Interesting, very interesting. I can't mention your name, the last person who's written, but interesting. Okay, so let's end the poll. Let's bring up the results on the awareness that these numbers potentially are slightly lower than we might expect. Anyway, you all know individually how that felt, so let's see. So if we thank you. So if I'll hand over to Ampersand to show the poll results unless people are already seeing it. Sharing poll results? Great. Okay, so the sciencey bit out the way really quickly. This is something called the idiosensory and the idiomotor response. So let me talk about the first experiment. So you've said sort of 30% of you saw yellow. Interesting. So I think the first thing to notice, okay, is something really important. If you take one thing away from this talk, it's this. If I brought a lemon in front of you right now and I brought it to your nose, you would smell it, you would taste it, and you would, your eyes closed, you would see yellow and you would salivate. I don't know if any of you started salivating, but for some reason, every time I do this experiment, I salivate. So you should try it on friends, and I promise you there's a fair amount of people who will salivate because your imagination is powerful. All I did was describe a lemon. Many of you saw yellow, many of you tasted yellow, some of you will have smelt yellow. The average response of this, and the term is idiosensory, an idea producing a sensory response in the body. The average response for seeing yellow is roughly around 70%. So I would have expected more of you to have seen yellow. And I think based on the chat, that was probably true. Number 2, if you tasted lemon, you have a very suggestible mind. You would be very good with hypnotherapy because the tasting of the scents and also the smelling of the lemon is that extra little bit of suggestibility that you've got ingrained in your nervous system. And the last one, 60% response, I would have thought it was even upwards of that. The feeling of the heaviness. All I am doing is describing a sensation, and your arm physically felt heavy because this is the power of the mind. This is the power of the imagination to change sensations in the body, the power of the imagination to change the muscles in your arm and how you feel, the idiomotor response, idea, motor, meaning movement response. So thank you so much for engaging enthusiastically with that, also for turning your cameras on. And I will share my last slide before we move over to the Q&A. So let's go to sharing last slide. So I hope you can see my share. And here we are. So in conclusion, I would encourage you to consider chronic pain as a sensory signal, a signal of the senses in your nervous system that is shiftable. The ABCD impact of pain, affect, emotion, bidirectional, that negative emotion makes you feel worse pain and that pain makes you feel negative. Conditioned, the fact that pain is a learned response that you learned a long time ago. It's your choice whether you want to continue with that story or change it. And the last, that pain is distractible, because your attention is your most powerful resource. Your imagination is also so powerful. It can induce changes in what you think you see, yellow, what you think you taste, what you think you smell, what you think you feel in your physical body. This has been proven in science, and so our pain threshold is much more elastic than we realize, and managing it with the power of the mind is not only possible, it's trainable with cognitive behavioral hypnotherapy. So, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for listening, engaging. I hope that you learned something, and happy to take any questions. Thank you to Ampersand as well. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rabia. And yeah, apologies for the whole mix up there, but I think I, for one, did experience a lot of those, tasting lemon and all sorts. So the suggestible mind. So we have some questions that were put forward on the form prior to the event, and we also are happy to take questions that come through on the chat. But perhaps if we start off with one that came through prior, which was, what would you say is the one thing that everyone should know about managing pain?
Great question to whoever asked that, and thank you for anticipating and coming in through before the session. So what is the one thing that I would want you all to take away about managing pain? I think it's this. I think it's the idea that not everybody thinks about managing pain psychologically. We think about managing pain physiologically. So we think to ourselves that taking medication will help. Unfortunately, in an ideal world, medication wouldn't have side effects and we wouldn't become addicted to painkillers. And so if that was the case, then I suspect we would be much better off. And also, I suppose the third aspect of tablet pain relief is the idea that we don't have a solution for every ailment. So sometimes painkillers don't work. So painkillers are not without their phenomenal ability. Where would we be without paracetamol and modern medicine? I have no idea. But in today's age, once we have maxed out our painkiller threshold, of what we're taking, I think the key thing I would like you to remember is that you can manage your pain psychologically, and you have a very powerful imagination and a powerful mind, and all it needs is the right training, and you will be able to change those sensory signals and feel differently.
Thanks very much. Some strong advice there. And we also had another from the survey prior. Do you have any quick tips for physical and psychological techniques that can help with pain? So perhaps that one step further of what can you practically do at home to practice that kind of technique?
Yeah. So I think that, the purpose of going into the idea of using your imagination is this idea that, distractibility. I'd love to hear what the audience thinks about distractibility, because I think it has a bad rep. I think it's the idea that we don't really want to distract ourselves, from it. We want to feel it, because if we feel it, then we understand it. And if we understand it, then our thoughts can try and interpret, what's going on. But there is a window of opportunity for distractibility to make a difference. And I think that window is when you have a diagnosis and you know that your clinician is telling you that let's take IBD, for example, your stool tests are normal, your bloods are okay, there's no more that they're offering. They're telling you that painkillers could probably cause constipation and you don't want to go the other way. And so you're you're just stuck in that space. And the idea that pain requires your attention is a really powerful one, because if you are able to shift your attention onto other things and sustain that attention shift, you will notice that the pain signals dim, like a dimmer on a light switch. So you want to be able to control that dimmer on that light switch. And the way that you do that is by training the mind to turn down the dimmer switch. It doesn't mean that you're ignoring pain. And of course, as a doctor, I would never advocate that. But it does mean that you are in control. How many people who have pain don't feel in control? And so it gives you that back if you can use the tool of distractibility. And also, this idea of suggestions. We give ourselves negative suggestions all the time. Take note of the thoughts that are running through your head when you're experiencing pain. If you could only replace them with positive thoughts, you are 50% of the way there. And I know that that sounds easy, I make it sound easy, but actually it's a skill. So I hope that answers some of the question, but feel free, whoever asked that, to unmute and share if you need to.
So we have a few more questions on the chat, and we also have a raised hand.
Yeah, I have a question.
Hello, hi.
Hi, I've been doing mindful meditation, and during this mindful meditation, you are asked to sit with your pain and get used to it that at one point you don't mind your pain that much because it's so familiar to you. You are not afraid of it. How would you address that in comparison to what you were saying about distraction, like dimming the pain? Like it's completely opposite and contradiction. So how would you address that? Thank you.
Thank you. That's such a fantastic question. I'm going to posit that it's not in contradiction, but I have to explain that very carefully. But I think you are very right to point that out, and I hope the answer is useful for a lot of people. So I love that idea of familiarity with your pain on one level. You know, we want to, as Eckhart Tolle said in the quote I read out, attention implies acceptance. Yeah? The first step is acceptance that you are in pain, that you are not constantly trying to fight this idea that you are in that pain. So mindfulness is all about attention to the present moment, acceptance of pain as the way that it is right now. And as you move into acceptance of pain, you transmute the pain. So you actually are then able to move past it. And I would love to hear your experience of that meditation, whether it has worked. Then I would say that is definitely the first step, is an acceptance. And what that will then mean is that you're not always striving, I suppose, for a complete numbing of the pain entirely. Because even hypnotherapy, even cognitive behavioral therapy, the strongest psychological techniques cannot get rid of pain entirely. They can only change the intensity and the frequency of pain. And so that's when the tools such as distractibility comes in, because the tools can be used together. Firstly, you want to establish an intimacy and a familiarity and an acceptance that pain exists in my body right now. Rather than fight it, I am going to tell myself that this is something that I have. You know, I accept that I have it. And then the next step from there is to say, now I would like to make some shifts in how I interpret that pain. There's a difference between the stimulus and the suffering. Do you remember me saying that? And it's your suffering that needs distraction, not the stimulus. So that's what I would say, is that it's a two-layered technique. The first layer, as you completely rightly point out, is an acceptance of that. And the second layer is essentially finding a way to turn that dimmer switch and change it so that you are in control. So that's probably how I would say it. I hope that makes sense, but please feel free to ask any follow-up from that.
If I can add to it.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just find it extremely interesting that when I sit with the pain, I concentrate on that. And what I noticed, the pain shifts like to different parts of my body. It doesn't go away, but at least it shifts to different spots, and it's kind of helps me to accept it better, I guess, and cope with that, because it's not always the same spot. I'm still working on it. It's, you know, it doesn't work like 100%, but somewhat it does.
Yes. Thank you so much for adding that. And I think that there's a hyper focus on, I think what it is that your meditation is asking you to shine the beam of light a little brighter on the spot that you're focusing on, and to accept that that's it. What I'm suggesting is that after you have allowed the light to shine on that spot, you then widen the light and you shine that light on everything else. So there's a really simple technique that we use in hypnotherapy, and it's the idea of widening our gaze. So I would suggest this for absolutely everyone here who suffers from anxiety, and also everybody who's glued to a laptop, as we all are right now, because technology drives the digital age. When you are really focused on an area, you're blinkered like a horse, and actually the brain is also very, very focused on that point. If you are in a state of feeling stressed or anxious, a really simple tip is to start to look around the room. Start to look out of the window, gaze down the street, gaze into the sky, and you will notice a dissipation of anxiety and stress as you take your attention off of all the focus off maybe your problems, your thoughts, your ideas, your physical sensations, and into the space around you. So I often practice this. Sometimes if I'm getting stressed or worked up, I loosen my gaze and I start to look around the room, up to the sky, around me, and it has a physical cognitive effect on the brain to dampen things down. So that's also another really super practical tip that you could use. And see how it works. I'd love to hear from you.
Great, thank you, Rabia. We have probably time for 2 or 3 more questions, and we have got more in the chat. So I've got a quick one here, and we have spoken about it, but when does distractibility turn to ignorance? So yeah, perhaps a reminder of your response to that.
Yeah, and absolutely, I understand where that question is coming from. So the question is, ignorant of what? Yeah, ignorant of a pain that could be threatening. Well, we've made sure that the type of pain we're talking about, this is probably why I spent so long in this talk laboring over the type of pain that we're talking about, because you don't want to distract yourself from a pain that could save your life, of course. And so any pain that is new under 6 weeks, any change in your pain, or a flare up that you recognize, as something is wrong, and you trust your instinct on that in a way. But there are certain guidelines. So anything under 6 weeks, anything that's a change, those are the kind of pains that you don't want to distract yourself from, because you want to seek medical attention. You don't want to be ignorant of those pains because they could actually be a threat to your survival. But the question is, ignorance of what? The problem we have is that pain as a signal in the body is like that car alarm that's going off, but there's no actual threat when it comes to chronic pain. And so my question is a reflection, really. Ignorant of what? The need to seek medical attention? Well, absolutely. We don't want to be ignorant of that. And so I suppose it takes some fine tuning. And remember that distraction is a short-term technique. It's there for your use in the pain. But if that pain keeps coming back with a vengeance and the alarm gets louder and louder and louder, well, then it's time to listen. And there's absolutely no doctor, I don't think, who wouldn't open their arms and say, please, I want to know, I'll conduct more tests. I'll search for that. I hope that's answered the question, but if not, please unmute.
We also have quite a technical question here, so I may have to read it a little bit slowly. So Dr. Rabia talked about inflammation, which could lead to sensitizing towards pain. Is that a brain interpretation response rather than a change in receptors or pain/cell physiology? And then is there a way to desensitize that if it is cellular?
Really, really good question. So I nipped that bit out of the talk. The answer is it's a physical receptor sensitization. So we have these things called nociceptors. They detect pain. So for those of you in the audience, a receptor is like something that detects a stimulus in the body. So our nociceptors are sensitized during pain to become hypersensitive. They deliver more electrical activity, and it leads to something in the nervous system called central sensitization. So if you want to read more about it, Google central sensitization of pain. And you will get a plethora of information on this idea that when we experience pain, our body creates a physical memory in the nervous system that means that we are more likely to be experiencing that pain again. And the reason being is because the body ultimately and the mind wants to protect us against death. And so it's reminding us, that's the memory. Similar to the way the immune system works with infections like COVID and the vaccine, in that you're developing a memory in your immune system. And isn't it beautiful that nerve cells and immune cells have memory in every cell of the body? But what happens when we don't want it to create the memory? And in answer to the second half of your question, how can we change it? Well, we can change it. It's a question of training. Everything is a skill that needs training. This is another reason why we're so late to get to these techniques, because in some ways, and I count myself included in this group, it is just so much easier to take a pill and to feel that pain go down in the threshold. I do it. You have a headache, you take a paracetamol and you do feel that downfall. Whereas psychological techniques are like skills. You go to the gym to build your bicep muscle so that you can lift heavier. What about training for the mind and the brain? So the nervous system can be retrained. Yes, it can be. The nociceptors can be retrained. It just takes time, effort, and the right techniques.
Thank you so much. And we have one final question, which almost is really building on what you've just said, but someone asking, just to check, is this for when pain medication management fails? So I guess, in the context of the big picture, when, I guess, from what you just said, it's complementary, but I'll let you kind of answer that one.
Thank you. I think I'm going to go back to the definition of acute and chronic pain. Because I think this is just so central. Acute pain that is, it's the pain that I want you to pay attention to and come and see me as a doctor about. Please don't ever forget that part. When it comes to chronic pain, I am loath to call these techniques I call them complementary, but I don't call them alternative. There's this idea of complementary versus alternative medicine. They're not alternative, they're complementary. Can you use codeine, Oromorph with these techniques? Yes. When does Oromorph take your pain from 10 to 0? For how long? So of course, complementary, not alternative. For chronic pain, not acute pain. I hope that makes that really clear. And the last thing I do want to mention, because I've used distractibility as a skill, and it's a controversial one, and I love talking about it. And the member of our audience who asked that brilliant question, we talked about how distractibility is maybe a second level skill to acceptance. There are lots of other skills in the plethora and the library of thinking skills that you can adopt. But obviously within the context of this talk, there's only time to talk about one. And we have mentioned another one, which is peripheral vision. So using your peripheral vision rather than a focused vision. And that's a really simple technique as well. So please, feel free to email me. I think Ampersand are going to put my website in the chat at the end. I offer cognitive behavioral hypnotherapy, and I also have lots of articles to expand on the topic. So hopefully more resources to come, particularly in their brilliant app. So.
Thank you, Rabia. Okay. So just to kind of, before we close off, we have got 3 other tips and tools for you to try that relate to this topic of managing pain. So in your app, you can find the trackers, which are your mood, stress, pain, diet and sleep tracker tools. And sometimes just kind of using those across the week or even more long term can help you kind of build a picture of what those symptoms and that pain looks like for you. As we do know that the lifestyle and well-being build a big picture of what pain feels like for you. So can give that a go. And finally, I think Sarah shared in the chat is you can also find the acceptance and commitment therapy course for managing chronic pain in your app, which uses mindfulness techniques, which Rabia also kind of touched on today. And finally, the What is Pain single, which really reminds you about what the difference between that acute and chronic pain is, which again, Rabia has spoken about in this session. So just some tips and tools for how to use your app to complement this session. And I think that is everything. So Sarah's going to launch a feedback poll. So if you are able to complete that, that would be fantastic, just to let us know how you found today's session. We will be in touch with you with the recording, so you always have kind of time to look back on what we discussed today, and continue to sign up for these events. We're really pleased to see you all, and for you all to kind of participate in the activity as well today was great. So thank you so much. So continue to join us by searching for your wellness guide on your email. Yeah, and just to mention, we've got some interesting events coming up. We have our meetups, which are patient-led activities for you to meet others living with both IBD and inflammatory arthritis, and also an event for you and your care circle. So the people that support you, they're able to join that event as well. And finally, I'd just like to say a massive thank you to Dr. Rabia. I definitely learned some things today, and it was super informative and insightful. So a big thank you, and thank you for everyone who's joined and listened. Rabia, if you have any last words to say, feel free to join in.
I would just echo, thanks for an invitation to speak on this platform. And I think that the courses, in the app provide that anchor in order for you to be able to follow along, with various things. And I'm privileged to be able to continue working with you to use breath work and breathing techniques for the relief of pain, and movement for the relief of pain. And how can we become, just really empowered? And so thank you for all the work that you do. And I encourage everyone to sort of engage heavily with the app and get on this idea that it's not one or the other, it's both.
Thank you so much. Yes, so again, thank you everyone for joining. I hope you have a lovely evening, and there's some resources that have been posted in the chat by Sarah. So a blog that Rabia wrote with us on breathwork, so you can find that on our website, and Rabia's website, which is also been pasted in the chat. So yeah, without looks like from the poll, lots of nice responses there. So thank you so much. And I think that's it. So good evening, everybody, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.